So welcome everybody. Really glad that you're here for this awesome webinar. Okay, so maybe it won't be awesome. No, it'll be awesome. And it'll be awesome because you all are here. So we're going to talk about the keys to sourcing and hiring people with disabilities. I think that a lot of employers, when I'm talking to them, what they say is that, well, why isn't it working what I'm doing right now? Why aren't people with disabilities just coming in through my typical pipelines and through my typical mechanisms for recruiting? And so we're going to talk about that in this webinar. It does require a little extra effort to reach people with disabilities. And there's a lot of history for the reason for that, which stems back to the fact that a lot of people with disabilities they've been discriminated against their entire lives, their entire generations. And so they're a little skeptical about employers, and there's so many employers now that want to employ more people with disabilities. They understand the benefits and that sort of stuff. So this webinar is focused really on telling you how to take those extra steps. I don't think they're that cumbersome, but they will reap you a lot of benefits. So we're going to talk about how to do this, why people are not there, and we're going to talk about how to become attractive. And I don't mean that we're going to put on high heels or, do our hair any differently. It just means that we're going to present our employer as more attractive to people with disabilities and entice them to want to apply for our jobs. So as you all probably know, if you've been on one of these webinars before, the webinar is being recorded so that a replay can be made available to those who could not make this live. It also allows you, if you enjoyed this webinar incredibly much, it allows you to rewatch it again. We want a lot of interaction on these webinars. Each one of them is becoming a little more interactive, which is just so great. I think the people who have been coming regularly are now getting the idea that we really want to talk to each other about this. It's not just about me getting up here and going yak, yak, yak. You will notice on your screen that Lisa Rizzo is here. She is taking care of all of the back-end things that I need help with to actually run a webinar semi-smoothly. So you'll see her there. She'll be reading out the chat to me and monitoring if somebody wants to raise their hand or anything. She'll make sure that I'm alert of these things. So let me get to that. When we talk about interaction, we would love it if you would use the chat as your primary mechanism. So to use it, there is a little bubble that looks like a speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. You just click on that. A window will open, and on this window, you can start typing your message. You want to note that there is a way to decide if everybody's going to see that, or if you want to make it more private, you can just click on the panelists as an option, and then you type in your message and click enter, and it'll hop into the chat. So the other part you can do is to raise your hand. This was kind of a new feature I didn't really understand very well, but there is a button down at the bottom of your screen that says reactions. And it's actually an opportunity to raise your hand. There it is. You can also give the little applause thumbs up thing if you want. But honestly, what I'm hoping you will use mostly is to raise your hand. If you have a question that's too elaborate for the chat, or you want an opportunity to make a comment and it's something that you just don't want to type into the chat, raise your hand, and Lisa will let me know that you've raised your hand if I haven't noticed. And we'll turn your mic on and have you ask your question or tell us your story, or provide us with the information that you want to share with everybody. And then remember, when you put your hand up, you do want to remember to lower your hand using that same functionality of the screen. So let's talk about my objectives for today, and then we're going to talk about your objectives. So my objectives for the day are to discuss disability sourcing. How do you source for candidates with disabilities? I'm going to talk to you a lot about how to show you how to leverage the disability community. That's the key. And give you tips for hiring. So beyond sourcing, what else do we need to think about when we are recruiting for people with disabilities? But I'm interested, what's your objective for today's webinar? So I'd love if you could type into the chat either sourcing, community, or hiring, and those stand for that you want to discuss disability sourcing. You want to be shown how to leverage the disability community, or give tips for disability hiring. I'm just curious what's on your mind based on those three objectives. It will help me balance the presentation to really hit what you're interested in. And again, just remember that this webinar is recorded. so that you will have access to the replay. I will send it out to you, but feel free to take screenshots of any of the slides that I'm going to show you today if you're interested in being able to retain this information in a little bit more clear format than whatever notes you're taking on your own. So, Lisa, do we have any votes?
Absolutely. And just as a reminder, we are putting in the chat what our main objective is, if it is sourcing, hiring, or leveraging community. And it looks like our top ones are sourcing, but we also have tips for hiring are on the top of the list, but all subjects are welcome.
Great. Well, thank you. And I will hit all of the topics, but just to make sure that I know where people really are interested to dig in. So one of the things that you may be wondering is why I am a person that's qualified to provide this webinar information. And so I just want to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. And as I was saying, looks like there's a couple of friendly faces in the audience, so some people already know me, but I started my career as a job developer. I helped people with disabilities find jobs. I went and I talked to employers and I convinced them that they should be employing the people I was providing services to. And I say convinced that way because I was not a very good job developer. As a job developer, I was only interested in the benefits to the person with a disability. And I wasn't thinking about or considering what the business needed. That just wasn't within how I was trained. It wasn't how my peers acted. They didn't look at that either. My supervisors never said to me, you really should be taking into consideration what the employer's perspective is. And that's because at the time, that's really how the field was developed. Now, this was a long time ago. I'm relatively old compared to probably most of you. But when I was trained to only be focused on the person with a disability, the job seeker. And so through my time helping people with disabilities find jobs and then working for a few of the governmental systems that help people with disabilities find jobs, I had an amazing opportunity to go and work for Walgreens. Walgreens wanted to become an inclusive employer of people with disabilities, starting with their distribution centers and then working over to the stores and eventually looking at the company enterprise-wide. And so that's what I got to do. Walgreens was the first company in our country to look at disability inclusion across their enterprise. Of course, many employers were looking at it from one specific facility or maybe one department of their company, but nobody was looking at it holistically across their whole company. The other thing that Walgreens did that was pretty unique was that we wanted to make sure that what we were doing was going to be replicable and sustainable, not just something that the passion of one executive was driving, but to make sure that it made sense for the business. And so everything that we did was through a lens of the business case, meaning that we wanted this to be fair to everybody involved, our customers, our employees, and our shareholders. We needed to be budget neutral or better to be able to sustain what we were trying to create. And so that's what I did for 7 years at Walgreens, really figuring out how do companies become successful in employing people with disabilities within, air quotes, the business case. So that's what I got to do. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. It took us 7 years to do it at Walgreens. It certainly doesn't take that long anymore, but we didn't know what we were doing. We were the first ones to do it. We were really exploring how does this work and trying things and then realizing it wasn't working and having to back out of them and go in another direction. And so it was a great adventure. I'm so proud of the work that we did there. And it continues to this day, which is really exciting. It wasn't just all talk to say we wanted to make it sustainable. Even after I left and the executive who championed it left. And so it keeps going. And so since leaving Walgreens, I've helped over 100 companies employ people with disabilities. And so I've learned a lot. Learning a lot at Walgreens was great, but that was just one company. Having the opportunity to serve more than one company helped me realize, how do you really make this universal? What are the true general aspects of employing people with disabilities that's common across all companies? And then how do you look for the things that will make it very unique for an individual company or within a company, their own location or their own division? The things that really feed disability inclusion and employment is the culture of a building or the leadership there of a work site and the amount of opportunity they have to hire people with disabilities, as well as the community as a whole, because we do draw on the community to help source the candidates, and that's what we'll talk about today. But so I always say, if you're not hiring people, you can't hire more people with disabilities. We don't hire people with disabilities just to be charitable. We do it because it makes sense for our business needing good labor. So let's talk about disability sourcing. Sourcing is sort of a new specialty within recruiting. It used to be that all recruiters also sourced, but now it's become a very specific component of recruiting. And there are people who are hired just as sourcers, which is still a word that Microsoft considers a misspelled word. So if you see it when I'm using it and it doesn't make sense to you, it's the people who are sourcing. That's their job title now. And sourcing is really focused on the pipeline, not on specific candidates, although it's candidates that are within the pipeline. But just to make sure that that nuance is explained. It's a lot of marketing and networking combined. That's what really, I think, makes a good person who's sourcing. They become brand advocates, as talking about the brand as an employer, not the brand of whatever they're selling if they're a B2C company. And sourcers need to be very proactive. As I started out saying, people with disabilities aren't just sitting in your pipelines of talent. They need to be coerced or enticed to look at your company as a place where they want to get a job. It isn't that they're, got so many offers that they don't know what to do with it, but it's really part of, unfortunately, the history of the disability community as a whole. And there are a lot of people who, because of their disability, they need assistance in finding a job or in starting out in a job. Those services are provided by agencies around the country. And so the people who are in those fields are sort of protective of the people with disabilities that they're providing services to. They've invested a lot in ensuring that that person's going to be a great employee, but they're also very interested in making sure that the person who's going to hire them is going to be a good employer. So part of a job of a sourcer in the realm of disability is making sure that you are telling the story and giving proof points that you're going to be a great employer of people with disabilities, not just a great employer of people. And so part of that is, within that story and that job, is then converting the people in this pipeline into applicants, not just getting them excited about it, but feeding them into the applicant tracking system, the application process, whatever your process is. It's potentially providing some support to just help them get in there, give them a little boost. And also sourcing, although it has become this kind of unique specialty within recruiting, it is everybody's job. I believe that when you work for a company, no matter what your role is there, you want to be a brand ambassador. You want to talk about how great the opportunity is to work there, because you want good employees there. You want your coworkers to be people with a lot of skills. So you want to sell the opportunities that are within your company. Or if you have a role specific in HR, even though maybe you're a benefits administrator or something, that you still want to think about sourcing as one of your responsibilities, to be that brand ambassador, to really encourage and entice people to want to apply for jobs for you. So let's talk about sourcing for being a good disability sourcer. So again, I'm trying to use this word. It doesn't feel very natural coming out of my mouth. But here are some of the characteristics that I think are really important for somebody who's sourcing into the disability community specifically. And that's to be open-minded. I think it's really important to be very open-minded about this and not have preconceived notions about people with disabilities and or what they can and can't do within the realm of all the opportunities that your company offers. Proactivity is incredibly important. You need to be proactive. As I said, the disability community is a little skeptical, so they do require a little bit of outreach to open that door and welcome them in. A level of comfort is important. I think many people are intimidated by people with disabilities. They're not sure how to talk to them or how to work with them or what they're allowed to do and not to do. That's just something that's within our society still. We're trying to break that down, but gaining that comfort is important. Curiosity about where else could I find people with disabilities. They aren't always in one place. People with disabilities as a whole is such a heterogeneous community. It's hard to talk about them as one group. So having that curiosity of continuing to look in different places for them is a great characteristic. Persistence. I think everybody who's a recruiter is pretty persistent, so that's not necessarily that unique. But for sourcing, you just have to be persistent to look for the answer or to continue to go back to a door and see if there's a different way to get through it to be able to open the floodgates of candidates. Sourcers need to be organized. I think these days we all need to be organized. And for those of us like myself who are not naturally organized, we just need to use our tools, really rely on our smartphones and everything that we have that's electronic that helps keep us organized and make sure that we stay on top of things and don't allow things to fall off of our plate. And finally, I think to be a good disability sourcer, you need to be passionate about what your company offers to others and be enthusiastic about the idea of being a more disability inclusive employer. Um, so it doesn't matter whether you're a sourcer as an outsourced entity who's just serving a business only doing sourcing, or whether that you're an internal person and doing sourcing either as part of your job or exclusively as your job. It doesn't matter. Those are still the characteristics that I think are really important to make you a good disability sourcer. So now I'm kind of curious, what other attributes did I not talk about that you think are important for a sourcer specifically, and hopefully about a disability sourcer? But what did I miss in this list? I talked about open-mindedness and proactivity, comfort, curiosity, persistence, organization, and passion. But what else do you think helps make a good sourcer, somebody who's looking into the disability community and trying to access more people into the pipeline? I'd love if you could add something to the chat, and I'm going to stop talking for a second and see if Lisa's got anything in there.
Great. So it looks like one that we have in the chat is that flexible is an excellent trait. I also have adaptable on the other end in a private chat.
Yes, you're right. Both of you. That's right. Flexibility might be almost the most important thing after that kind of passion, the drivenness to find the answer. Because the disability community has this history of knowing that they've been discriminated against and sort of this protectiveness. Flexibility is one of the best ways to demonstrate that you're interested in employing people with disabilities and that you're truly invested in making that successful for them. So thank you. Those are both great additions to this. And when I do this presentation in the future, I'm going to add that to the list.
Right. We also have a willingness to educate yourself and staff on strategies and accommodations.
Yes, and humility that kind of feeds into that. Mm-hmm. You aren't necessarily the expert. I think those are great traits. I'll be taking this entire chat and adding it in this presentation for the next time that I do it. So thank you. Anything else in there, Lisa? Okay, great. All right. So sourcing is a mix of 4 different things. You're marketing, you're networking, you're hunting, and you're engaging. So I just want to talk about those for a minute when we're talking about sourcing people with disabilities. So in marketing, I think I put it that you need to make sure your company is oozing disability inclusion and welcoming people with disabilities. And I say it like that because that was actually, I felt that was my charge when I was with Walgreens, was to convince everybody, to market them that Walgreens is just so excited about employing more people with disabilities. And so I was just trying to lace it into everything that we did and every way we were doing things. Walgreens was a huge company, so I was never completely successful in doing that. I constantly heard from people saying, "Oh, I didn't know Walgreens was employing people with disabilities. How come you didn't tell me that?" And it's like, boy, I feel like I do it all day long. So if you feel like you're saying it too much, you're not. There's still more people who need to get that message. So just making it ooze out of there, and ooze in a good way, not in a gross way. Expanding your current sourcing resources. So again, you don't have everybody that you could in your candidate pool right now. People with disabilities they're in so many different places. So you need to expand your ideas. And that kind of feeds into what we were just saying in the chat. Not think that your strategy and the way you're doing things right now is the only way to do things. And I think that you need to create this interest by talking about how you're welcoming people with disabilities, telling your story, and celebrating things that you learn to do that are a little bit different, but are going to make a huge difference in welcoming people with disabilities to your company and to the pipelines of talent. Networking, I think, is the biggest thing where people miss out on. I have spent the last year really talking to the community that serves people with disabilities about LinkedIn and how important it is to be on there. And it's now built a really good, a very large number of people who are in that industry who are now on LinkedIn, and they're representing their agency. They're not there to get a job for themselves. They're there to create the connections with businesses that want to employ people with disabilities so that they can help their job seekers get jobs. And so I think that that networking component from LinkedIn is really important. If you're on LinkedIn, and I'm assuming if you're in recruiting or sourcing that you are already on LinkedIn, start searching for agencies and entities that serve people with disabilities and help with the employment of people with disabilities, help with disability inclusion. Follow those hashtags. Those are things that really help you find these entities and start networking with them to learn more about what they've got to offer, how they can help you, and keep moving forward. I think you need to become familiar and engage with the disability community. I'm going to talk a lot about that in the next section. But one quick, easy win is to think about your current employees. How many of them have family members or friends who are people with disabilities? And I say that because 1 in 4 people in this country have a disability. So you can bet that all of your employees who maybe don't have a disability know somebody who does. It's just very rare that you meet anybody who doesn't know anybody with a disability. And sometimes they just don't realize that the person they're talking about is a person with a disability. Some people aren't understanding what that whole term means. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also connect with some of the generic disability groups like Centers for Independent Living or the American Association of People with Disabilities, or because these entities outreach to and connect to the entire disability spectrum. But also look at disability-specific ones like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASON, or the Down Syndrome Congress, or the Autism Society, or there's endless ones. So there's all sorts of ones that are very specific to one particular type of disability. And so just networking with a few of those will also be really helpful. For one, they give you a lot of information and resources you can use for employing more people with disabilities, but 2, they can help become your pipeline of talent. So that's, I think, really a great way to do things to spend your networking time and your networking effort is into networking with the disability community as a whole, and to get disability aware, understand the nuances of that. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. So let's talk about hunting. I think some people are resistant to the idea of hunting, but that's what sourcing really is. If it was obvious, it'd already be in your pipeline. When you're hunting for people with disabilities, you're actually being very tactical, understanding the community, and then leveraging the opportunities to inject yourself into there. So I don't want it to sound painful or awful, but it is a lot like hunting. When people are good at hunting, if they're hunting for deer, they understand how deers operate and how deers think and what they do, and more stuff that I don't know because I'm not a deer hunter. But if they're going to be successful, they have to understand the environment and the prey that they're preying after. That doesn't sound right, so I'm sorry. But I think that that's really important that you think about it from that perspective. You want to create interest and drive talent into your organization. And just to use the metaphor with deer, for a while, people who hunt deer put out salt licks and things like that that will attract the deer. The deer says, "Oh, there's something I want." So they understand what the deer want, and they offer it to them to draw them in. There are disability-specific job boards. Some of them are free, so you can post your jobs on there. It's a great way to get in there. Some of those are locally based, and some of them are national. So pay a little bit of attention as to whether you think you're going to find anything through there, and feel free to give feedback to those job boards. I didn't get any candidates through you because you can track that just like most other job boards. That's, I think, a really great opportunity to test the waters and get in there, topping on people's websites that are disability specific, focused on employment. There's quite a few now, so you can just simply Google it now. And looking again at professional and social networks like LinkedIn, even on Facebook. I think that there are a lot of professionals with disabilities groups on Facebook as well as on LinkedIn. So just searching those to use them as a tool. Are there any comments, Lisa?
So far, we do not have any. I did post a couple links in the chat that go along with these last couple slides.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I could see the number going up and I forgot about this. All right, so let's talk about engaging. So when you're hunting, unlike my metaphor in the previous slide, we're not trying to kill anybody. We're trying to engage with them. We want to find them, we want to draw them in, we want to connect with them, and we want to engage with them. So this involves messaging, emailing, picking up the phone. People tend to forget that that's something we can do, although COVID kind of reminded us again that the phone works. But we've sort of got into electronic communication, and just remember the phone's a really effective way to do things. And then repeating your outreach to people and your communication to them, and then tweaking it, seeing what's effective, what's really resonating with particular people with disabilities or the disability community as a whole, and looking at how you're approaching this engagement, and continuing to try to improve it. Don't just stick with one strategy and then go. Always look for ways to improve it. Again, going back to the idea that the adaptability and thinking about, how there's not just one way to do this, and we want to continue to find better ways to do it. And you want to keep doing that until you have a great qualified slate of candidates that are filling every opening that your company has. So that's your goal as a sourcer, is to fill those slates, but it's kind of an avenue to get there. So let's talk about leveraging the disability community. And I will try to get through this really quickly for two reasons. One, because it can be exhausting, and it's what I'm really passionate about, so I don't want to drag you through that. But two, because it's not what anybody picked in the objectives. But you need to know your target market. Again, there's a reason people with disabilities are not currently in your pipeline, and it is because you're not marketing to them. You don't understand your market. So let's talk about building comfort and confidence. And that's, I think, the key for a lot of people when they are just stepping into the role of sourcing for people with disabilities. It can feel intimidating, it feels uncomfortable. As I mentioned before, in society, we have these perceptions about people with disabilities, and it can cause fear for us. So building that comfort and confidence, I think, is really important. First of all, this is what you need to know. 1 in 4, and if you ask some people, 1 in 5 people with disabilities in this country have a disability. People have a disability. I think I said that right. So if you look at this map, boom, that's a lot of people that you're missing if you're not targeting them as well. It's last I saw, 62 million people in this country in the working age. That's a lot of people. So you want to be going after them. But I think it's important that you keep in mind that not all disabilities are visible. So we tend to think of the person in a wheelchair as your traditional symbol of disability. It's only 1% of the people in the world are using wheelchairs. So that's not very many. It's not representative. And that's because only a quarter of the disabilities are ones that you can see or that you can tell. That's not a lot of people. When we're talking about 328 million people in our country, and that's a rough number, and 20% of them are people with disabilities, that's 65 million people. 48 million of them, you can't see their disability. It's not obvious. So when you're thinking about all of this as a holistic approach, just keep in mind, first of all, that you probably already have people with disabilities in your workforce and in your pipeline, but they're not disclosing, and that's a different it's a different webinar. It was last month's webinar, but we'll talk about that more. So I've talked a little bit about leveraging the disability community, and I'm going to go into more of it, but I'm curious, what is your biggest concern related to leveraging them? Is it that you're not sure what to say, or that you don't know where to find them, or all sorts of things? And then I would love for people to also share where you found success in that. If you've taken any approaches towards leveraging the disability community for your sourcing or for your hiring, what pots of gold do you already have? What secrets have you learned? And I'm going to pause, and I'm going to kind of force y'all to put something into the chat, because silence forces people to do.
So for the first one, we have not knowing what to say or the right communication tools.
Those are perfect. All right. Well, I will move forward, but please keep typing those things in there, because I am very interested in that, and I will be hitting on some of them, but I'd love to bring out some other things.
And for not knowing, we have that the biggest issue is trying to get to the right audience.
Yes. Perfect. So let me pop through these slides really quick just to get them out there in front of you, and then I'm going to answer those questions. And if you have any more, just add them in there, and we'll get to that. So there's ways to increase your familiarity. So how do you find them? Where are they? What to say? So here's some really quick, easy ways to do it. Attend events. Disability organizations have job fairs. This is July, so July 26th is the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's going to be a lot of activity going on right now, probably via social media, et cetera. But people having in-person events and virtual events talking about that. So that's a great way to find people, is to go to these events. Also, dipping your toes in with free partnerships. Colleges and universities are great ways to leverage candidates with disabilities, and that's free. And developing partnerships with community disability services organizations is another great way to dip your toes into this. And I'm actually, next month's webinar is exclusively about creating partnerships with disability services organizations. And again, those are free relationships. So I'm not going to talk about that at all this time. And I think Lisa's going to pop into the chat the registration information for that, but just know that August's webinar is about this. And since you're on this webinar, you will get an email in the future also announcing that webinar is going to be coming up and reminding you to register. So utilizing your internal assets. Almost every company's got something in there, even if you're a real small company, that can help you. So connecting with your company's disability-focused business resource group, affinity group, employee resource group, whatever you want to call it. Recently, I just heard disability inclusion and belonging as a new way to describe these kinds of groups, but almost every company has started creating them now. And even if your company doesn't have one that's disability focused, leveraging those diversity groups and asking them to think about how you can be more easily access disability community can be really a great internal asset for you. Dialoguing with any employees that you know do have disabilities, that's trickier. You're probably going to be talking to people who have obvious disabilities, so only 25% of the group, but it's still a way to learn more and realize, get more acquainted with this. And then using internal communications like newsletters or internal websites to ask for help in this way. That was one of the things we did at Walgreens. We put it on our internal employee-only newsletter and said, hey, we're moving in this direction. What do you guys think? How can you help us? And we gave them a dedicated email address for that. And we got a lot of really great ideas just from the internal folks who worked for us. Learning disability culture. So let me talk about people first language, disability civil rights, disability awareness, specific etiquette. Oh my God, this list is so long. The full definition of disability, and learning why they're not currently in your pipeline. Okay, so the disability culture is a culture within itself. And even within that culture, there's subcultures on different disability groups. You want to become familiar with that. There are a lot of webinars that I've already done about this, and webinars that will be done in the series talking about different things. I'm not even sure if this one I have specific ones that I was going to mention. I do a disability. I hear music. I do offer a disability awareness course. It does have some money cost to it, but it's pretty cheap, I think. It's called Disability Awareness, the Fast Track, and it has got set up, designed because employers asked for something quick. It's 37 minutes in length, and it's 6 different units that talk about what does disability mean, and it's presented in common language instead of in some of the more intricacies about disability language, like people first language. In the disability community, we appreciate when people use people first language, meaning that we're always going to refer to somebody as a person with a disability, not the disabled, or a person who's blind, not that blind person. It just means that the person comes first and is the bigger part of their identity, and their disability is just a piece of it. But knowing that, also, there are some people, distinct people within the disability community who do use their disability as their identity. And so when you get to meet people with disabilities, you'll learn what's their preference for how to be referred to, and just being respectful of that, being aware of that makes you an ally and very distinguishable against those who don't honor those kinds of things. Disability civil rights, as I said, we as a society have been discriminating against people with disabilities a long time. So there's a lot of history within that. So if you want to learn the specific etiquette that's covered in that, I also did a webinar on it. So The other ways to learn about the disability culture is just diving into the traditional ways to learn about any culture: books, webinars, going to local events through agencies that specialize in these things, videos. I think a great one was the HBO movie about Temple Grandin. I think it starred Claire Danes. It's a great movie to learn more about the disability population. And in fact, right now, I think Oprah and Prince Harry are doing a series, I think on Apple TV, but I forget which streaming service it's on, but about folks with mental illness and what it's like to be struggling or managing a disability, a mental illness along the way. There's a ton of podcasts out there, which is great. Deborah Rue does one. There's tons of social media. Of course, that can feel a little overwhelming, but that's a great way to do it. Just simple web searches, Google your community name and disability and employment, and you will get a lot of hits. That's ways to explore things. But have conversations with people with a variety of disabilities. Sometimes employers tend to attach to one disability type. Maybe there's an executive who has a loved one with a particular disability type, and so they focus on that. Then we saw that at Walgreens. We started out, our executive had a son on the autism spectrum, and so we were very focused on autism in the very beginning, but realizing that the disability population is incredibly diverse and very large. And so focusing on just one disability really restricted our opportunities. So have conversations with people with a variety of different kinds of disabilities. Okay, let's start talking faster. Okay. Use your internal allies, your recruiters. If you're simply focused on sourcing, you want to leverage your recruiters, your ERG, any employee referral programs. If you can put out communication to your employees that you have a great employee referral program for candidates and remind them that you want to employ people with disabilities. Again, that's such a great way to really help employees realize that what you're talking about is everybody that you want to recruit, not just people that look like the ones who are already there if you don't have folks with disabilities yet. It's a great way to open the door. And then these external partnerships, which again will be in the next next month's webinar. Okay, so let's get into disability hiring. Create a good candidate experience. Taking them from prospect to applicant to candidate to potential employee to new hire to employee. All of that, we want to be mindful of people with disabilities and where there might be inadvertent barriers. That's what we uncovered at Walgreens, and every company I've worked with since then, we have uncovered at least one or two unintended barriers that we didn't realize were keeping people with disabilities from coming all the way through that process, or even wanting to think about applying to begin with. And so looking at it holistically across the employee life cycle, how can we be more welcoming to people with disabilities? Where are our little pitfalls that we need to think about? So that's, I think, really important when we're talking about hiring people with disabilities, is not just thinking about the interview itself or not just thinking about the application, but the whole thing. You want to manage that relationship with the employee as they go through all of these stages. And clear communication, I think, is the answer there. I have run into a few situations with companies where the attorneys are not that welcoming of a lot of clear communication. So you kind of have to tread that line carefully, tread that water carefully. But I think that that's always working towards transparency and good communication is the way to encourage more and more people with disabilities to apply. There are do's and don'ts. So when we talk about people with disabilities, we are talking about people with health protected information. It's a vulnerable population that is protected against discrimination. So you do want to know, what am I allowed to ask? What am I not allowed to ask? So you can learn about disability etiquette from April's webinar. We talked about all sorts of different etiquette related to people with disabilities, the broad spectrum of disability. Flexibility, that was somebody already brought in there. Being as flexible as you can, and then pushing the envelope on flexibility sometimes I think is really a way to be more successful in this approach to wanting to hire more people with disabilities. That flexibility, your job is to find the best candidates possible. Legal's job is to be as risk averse as possible. You're going to be in conflict with each other, and that's a good conflict. both of you are in the interest of looking at the interest of your company. And so you want to continue to be as flexible as possible, look at other ways to do things that don't violate any laws, but at the same time, really extend that welcome mat um, to the disability community. Be familiar with your company's process for accommodations. I can't tell you how many times I've met a recruiter who has no idea how somebody should be asking for an accommodation if they need one for the interview, much less for employment. It doesn't mean everybody with a disability is going to be asking for an accommodation. In fact, most people with disabilities don't use accommodations when they're working, which seems weird, doesn't it? But that's actually what the statistics bear out right now. However, if you're familiar with that accommodation process, then when you can talk about it, you're not stumbling over your words, and you're messaging to the person with a disability that they're welcome. A lot of people with disabilities fear that an employer thinks that an accommodation request is like a burden versus what it really is, which is to help people be successful. We want people to be their best. And when you need an accommodation, if you're not going to ask for it, then you can't be your best and you can't be as productive as possible. So I think that that's something that you can do when you're hiring people with disabilities intentionally, is to know what the accommodation policy is and the process, and just feel comfortable with it. I have a great story from 2006, so it's an old story. But when I was at Walgreens, internally, I was known as the disability lady, and we had 250,000 employees, but they all knew me as the disability lady. And somebody from the recruiting department, who was in charge of welcoming folks when they came in for interviews, she called and left me a voicemail in a panic saying, "There's somebody who's deaf here and I don't know what to do." And I felt bad that I hadn't provided her any training, because the simple thing is you use a pen and a paper and write out to the person to communicate with them. But she was just felt overwhelmed with that idea. So thinking about accommodations, specifically things like that, I think it's really important that you're able to have a little bit of familiarity with that and know where the resources are for that. So I had to reach out back to her an hour after I got the voicemail saying, okay, here's the folks locally that can provide for sign language interpreters if that's the accommodation that's needed. But what you first need to do is to talk to the candidate that came in, and ask them using a pen and paper or texting or whatever, if they're going to need any sorts of accommodations. Because what she did was she actually just sent them away. She said, no, 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 and tried to signal to them that they should leave. And they were coming for an interview that had already been signed up for. So that was a long time ago, and I think we've corrected those kinds of processes with a lot of companies. But understanding your accommodation process, I think, is important. Ensuring that your company looks welcoming. So we are all run by systems now, applicant tracking systems, etc. That's really important. External communications and accessibility. I think. Yes, okay. Accessibility of these systems. So looking at your applicant tracking system, or whatever process you use right now for processing applications, is it accessible? Meaning, not just can people touch it, that's what accessibility can mean, but there's a very specific requirement about electronic systems being accessible to a very specific part of assistive technology that's called screen readers. So there's a whole bunch of laws and regulations. I'm not going to get into that. Section 508 is what it's called, that defines that. And if your applicant tracking system is not compliant with that, it's not accessible. And that means you're missing a lot of candidates. People who use that kind of assistive technology are great employees, and they've got the skills you need. They just can't access the information on your website. It has nothing to do with their ability to do their job for you. So make sure your applicant tracking system is accessible. You can use the Job Accommodation Network if you need to assess that, or you can just run a quick test. Just Google it, and you'll be able to see where your applicant tracking system has issues. Most applicant tracking systems are not 508 accessible, no matter what the vendor who sold that software to you says. They don't have the expertise to do that, and so they do some things in there. They don't keep it up to date, etc. So it's well worth researching yourself. Looking at your e-commerce site. So Target got sued, and it was a massive case where people couldn't shop online. People who were blind could not shop online because Target's website was not completely 508 compliant. And so it cost the company a lot of money, but worse, it was a lot of bad PR. So although people who were blind couldn't shop there, people with other kinds of disabilities said, well, wait a minute, this company doesn't care about people with disabilities as a customer, so I'm going to go shop somewhere else. So again, this is important from an employer branding point of view. You say you want to hire people with disabilities, but people with disabilities can't shop on your online site, then how can you be serious about wanting to employ people with disabilities? So looking at that from that whole spectrum, I think, is really important. Making sure that your storefronts and your services and your products are accessible. So that was a battle I had at Walgreens. We had very small stores. When the truck came and product was being brought into the aisles to be loaded onto the shelves, every once in a while, a store manager would accidentally make an aisle so narrow because of the product that was being stacked there to get put on the shelves that it was no longer accessible to people with wheelchairs. And we got sued a lot for that. And every time we did, it hurt our efforts to employ more people with disabilities, to put that messaging out there. So being able to connect with your partners across your company and discuss why it's important to be as accessible as possible is really important. And then to think about your external facing communications. That one's pretty easy. You just get your marketing people and your communications people to, say on your website and put out on social media, we want to do this, news coverage stories, and your ads are all including people with disabilities and things like that. That part's easy, but making sure that your internal messaging tools are reflecting that as well is equally as important. That was something I heard a lot at Walgreens the first year I was there was, well, you say externally to the world that you want to employ people with disabilities, but internally, I'm not seeing any of that messaging. I'm not seeing that evident in all of these different avenues of communication that we had. And so I started working with the internal communications people as well. How do we convey this better? Everybody was waiting for the success story. Well, we can't get the success story if we can't get the candidates in. So we need to find ways to improve our messaging and just ensure that we are consistent across the board. Finally, I think it's really important that you know the why. Why is your company employing people with disabilities? You want to become an ally to that. And so you need to become familiar with the business case. I know I put air quotes around that. Some people aren't familiar with that phrase, so I always like to put air quotes around it. The business case is something that demonstrates all of the reasons that you want to employ people with disabilities. And of course, I have created a product that's free. I think Lisa's going to pop it into the chat, but you can download this from my website. It's an entire book that has all the data and all the citations that you need to know why employing people with disabilities is good for your company. Why it's good for the bottom line. There are a lot of different realms where including people with disabilities actually improves things: safety, productivity, attendance, turnover, stock price, even. All of those things, we see an increase in the profitability of companies when they're employing people with disabilities across those metrics. So it's good to know that. And that book may feel overwhelming. There's a lot of different reasons why you want to employ people with disabilities. But then you want to look back at your own company and say, well, what's our real reason? Right now, I'd say the number one reason is because we're struggling to hire. We're struggling to hire everybody, not just people with disabilities. So people with disabilities is a candidate pool that you're probably not fully tapping right now. And so that's probably your why right now. But there are other whys, other reasons that you want to employ people with disabilities. So if you want to get familiar with them, feel free to just download that from my website. Like I said, it's free. It's not one of the things that I charge for. So what have I said so far? Oh, good, we got 12 minutes. What have I said so far that has triggered ideas for you or questions? But really, what are you looking for more information on? I think we hit the ones from the comments before, but if you feel like I didn't talk about something enough, please feel free to pop it into the chat or raise your hand, and Lisa will serve as our communication agent here to really look at what you've heard and seen today that's provoked you to think, I need to do this differently, or I want to try that, or I still don't understand this. So I'm going to pause and see if anything's going to hop into the chat.
Great. And thank you guys again so much for being here. So go ahead and pop things into the chat. While we do that, there were a couple comments about big concerns or successes that we had earlier as well. So someone had said that as a job developer, they find that employers feel that they don't have time to navigate the process and that it's extra work, which I think everyone can relate to very, very much. But there was, to make that on the happier side, someone shared a success that they find it beneficial that people hear our stories and what we do, and they get where turning around how they can get on the bandwagon with successes that others have found.
Yeah.
And that
And I
they've
think,
leveraged small businesses to support internships, and success was found and hiring followed.
excellent. I think that those points actually are what we're really going to focus on in the next webinar. The partnerships that you can forge with disability organizations in your local area are going to be time savers. There may require a small investment of time in the beginning just to get to know them, but then they become your sourcers. They become your recruiters. And they're not just pulling candidates towards you, but they're also doing some of the screening for you. That's the value of the partnerships, which is why I devoted an entire webinar of this series across the year to it, is because businesses, I don't think, realize the benefits of creating these partnerships, because that's what job developers do, or they might be called employment support professionals, or I don't know, there's a whole bunch of titles that all kind of merge together. But the idea is they're helping a person with a disability find a job. And unlike what I was like back in the 90s, they now know how important it is to connect with the employer and think about, what does the employer need? And how do I work with the candidates I'm representing, the job seekers I'm representing, or if I don't have the right job seeker, how do I help them leverage the other entities like myself within our community so that somebody with a disability can meet your needs as an employer and be able to help you become more inclusive? Because once you have one or two successes, and I think somebody sort of mentioned this, it just snowballs in a good way. That it's sort of like the tipping point. If any of you are familiar with that book, the Malcolm Gladwell book, you just need one or two successes, and all of a sudden your pipeline opens up with great candidates, and your managers become much more comfortable with this, and your entire workforce all of a sudden gets really excited about seeing this success. You just need a couple of them to get you there. And it may feel a little bit painful and awkward to get to those first couple, but it's so worth it. But the agencies that you can create partnerships with will help you through that. But even if you don't go through the partnership route, because sometimes that isn't a good fit for a business, just taking some of those steps that I described today and finding the opportunity for just one. Some of the best success stories I've got is when a company has decided to do some internal messaging to their employees and say, we want to employ more people with disabilities, and this is kind of what we mean by that. This isn't going to be a charitable thing. We want to find people who can do these jobs, who know they can be great employees, and they get internal referrals from their own employee base and say, oh, I've got a cousin who I wasn't thinking about, but this person, they have diabetes and they'd be great in here. Or I have an uncle and, he lost a leg in an accident, but boy, he would be great. These are things that just with a little bit of effort, you can actually get some really great success stories. Is there anything else new, Lisa?
We do. We have a question. Other than Jan, do you have any other sites or resources about technological accessibility on application process?
Wow. I think there's there are some consulting groups out there that specialize in accessibility for applicant tracking systems. They charge you a lot, and Job Accommodation Network is free, and I just think they're the best. I honestly do. I used them when I was at Walgreens. I don't think they're they don't market themselves very well because they're funded by the Fed, so they don't have a lot of money for marketing. But once you get in there, they're just a treasure trove of help on testing your system. But otherwise, I would just Google 508 compliance applicant tracking systems, and there's quite actually several. I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but there are several tests you can just connect your URL to, and they'll give you some reds and greens on where you're accessible and where you're not. So it doesn't help you fix it, but then again, that's what the consultants are for. But they'll charge you for the assessment. So I don't want to bash them because consultants need a living also. But sometimes there's things where you realize, I don't know what's inaccessible and what's accessible, and that can scare companies. That's why I think Jan is such a great tool or opportunity to use their ways of checking the applicant tracking system, because that information isn't going to go anywhere, and it gives you time to plan how you're going to make it accessible, because some of that stuff takes time and investment, and if you don't have the capital right away, you're going to need to schedule it out. But just being aware of what those problems are or those barriers are can also help you find a fix around them that isn't a technological fix. One of the very simple things is to put on your website, here's a dedicated email address if you're struggling or having any issues with this application process, you know, whatever that you want to make the email address, make it into a generic one that's, covered by everybody. And it's basically usually the answer is for somebody who's visually impaired, you're going to get on the phone with them and read them the questions and fill out the answers for them. It's things like that that can be really low tech that can give you the workaround. But if you don't know what the barrier is, it's more challenging. But so I don't have a great answer for that one because I always use Jan. I just think Jan's the best, and they've been around for so long. I've never needed to look for anything else.
Great. And then we just have some thank yous for this webinar, and that so far it's very, very helpful.
Well, good. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll try to finish this up. So as always, I always talk about the webinars that are coming up. We are at the halfway mark in this series. This is the first year I've done one where I've actually followed through and done it the whole year, but I think that it's really exciting. So I really encourage everybody to come to next month's webinar. The nuts and bolts of creating partnerships with disability organizations can be tricky feeling. So I've had a lot of mistakes made and I learned a lot, and I'm just going to wash it all down there for you guys to take advantage of, and hopefully it'll give you some ways to do things that aren't too time consuming and have a high return on investment for any time investments you need to make. So we'll talk about that. But then of course in September and October we're going to be talking about management and performance management. That seems to be a very big hang up for a lot of companies, so I'm devoting 2 webinars to that. The performance management one will coincide with Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is a great celebration in October. So maybe we'll have some kind of treats for that sub webinar as well to just to celebrate what's going on. And then we're going to close out the year with how do you grow a disability culture for those of you who have already are somewhere in this journey and you just want to grow it, make it better. We're going to talk about that, and then refreshing your effort, because I've met a lot of companies who started down this path 4 years ago, didn't do much to change it. Maybe they've had turnover in their staffing, where people in charge of that or their executives who are champions of that, and they need to look back on it and revive it. And how do you know when you're there, and what do you do when you get there? So that's what December's will be like. So as always, register for the webinars. Each one you have to register for individually. I'm apologizing for that in the future, but I know Lisa's popping in the chat the link that you can go to my website, and you'll see all of the registrations are on that same page, as well as the replays if you want to catch any of the previous ones. And questions. I should stop putting the slide on the end because we always get to the questions before now. But if anybody has any last questions, please feel free to toss it in the chat. I will stay here for the next 3 minutes just to be sure that we didn't miss anything. And when I send the link to the replay, I will make a point of copying the chat into all the links from the chat into that, so that you can make sure that you don't lose those. There's a great resources, and Lisa, thank you so much for your support on this. You guys have really supported me through this whole series, and I'm so appreciative of it, because if I tried to do this by myself, we all know it wouldn't come off as smoothly as it does.
No problem. Happy to help.
Any last minute, anything, comments, questions?
Just a thank you. Great information as always.
It's 2:00, so I'm going to let y'all go. Thank you, Lisa. Really appreciate your help.